We'd like to say a word of thanks, Dick, for reading our scripture today, and thank you, Wesleyan Choir, for sharing that special song as we jump into our message today. You know, there's a lot of talk these days about building bridges or about being a bridge, which may at first make this story from Nehemiah seem a little off or a little strange because it's about building a wall or rebuilding a wall. And there have been mixed emotions, of course, about building walls in our recent history. So let's consider our context in today's story about Nehemiah, his love for God, his love for his country, and his love for his people. Let's see where we can find hope as Nehemiah, led by God's Spirit, goes back to his beloved city, Jerusalem, and rebuilds the walls of the city that have been destroyed in previous years by conquering nations. You know, some people are really good at building things, and truth is, some are not. My building or assembling things looks like building a small dam on the little creek on our family farm when I was a kid, which fed into what was called Buffalo Marsh, only it was more of a pond to water the animals than it was a marsh, but it sounded cool. My cousin Robbie and I loved throwing in and stacking rocks and sticks and logs in to build a small dam, but we could never really make it big enough to pull up the water more than just a couple of feet. A big rain would then come along and wash it all away, but we'd rebuild it and use it as a bridge that we could cross over on to the other side. Of course, there on the farm we built fence. We assembled domes for our silos and put those on top. We built and repaired roofs. On mission trips, I've had the opportunity to be part of building stoves in Guatemala, building homes in Honduras, a retreat center in Four Corners, and then refurbishing homes in Gulfport, Mississippi, and New York from floods. In my first appointment, I had the privilege of serving with a group of people who purchased 26 acres of land and together built a 31,000 square foot worship educational center. And of course, there's building or putting together smaller things like bikes and desks and cabinets and toys for your grandchildren. My grandsons and I built a wooden car and a wooden plane at Christmas. Now, there was nothing fancy about it, but lots of fun trying to get each piece in the right place, glued in the right place, to keep it there, and then for at least to be functional that the wheels would turn round and round. And what a time they had with their mom and dad at Build-A-Bear after Christmas. I did find it a bit odd that they both built dragons at Build-A-Bear. However, they loved building those dragons. Do you enjoy making things, building things? Now, it can get a little frustrating when things don't go or turn out as you planned or hoped for. There's been times, I know for me, that frustration kicked in and I needed to push that pause button for a moment and just walk away. I needed to let my left side brain catch up with my right side brain to think on it and ask, God, why in the world can't I get this to work? I need a little help here. And after giving it some space, try again. And so often, lo and behold, it seems like it comes together. Sometimes it helps to step back, to step away for a few moments. What have you built? Or what have you put together lately? It can be so fun and satisfying when it all works out. But it can also be so frustrating and demoralizing when it doesn't. And then we think of the task that God called Nehemiah to, and most of our building of things honestly pales in comparison. The walls and the gates of Jerusalem are ginormous, and that means really big. And so the walls of Jerusalem average 39 feet in height, 8.2 feet in thickness, and it's 2.5 miles around. And if you have had the privilege of traveling to Israel and you've seen it in person, you know how majestic it is. When Nehemiah returns, the walls were in ruins, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 587 to 586 BCE. And of course, that was just after the time of Jeremiah, who bought that field that Pastor Emily talked about last week. In the years that followed the siege and destruction, the people of Israel now find themselves in captivity, serving as slaves in a foreign land. Many psalms of lament were written during those days of exile. The people longed for their homeland and returned to their place of worship, though in that time they did learn much about God, and that God was not restricted to a temple in a particular place. Maybe like we've learned much about God during this year of pandemic, where we've not been able to gather for worship in this particular place, and yet we've still worshiped the living God. I'm reminded also of this time, the stories of Daniel, which we love, and it gave the people hope as over and over God's presence and faithfulness shows up in lions' dens and fiery furnaces, watching over them. And their faith in God begins to influence others beyond their Jewish land. Slowly but surely, the Jewish people began to return from exile to their familiar homeland. The first exiles returned in 538, and work on the temple was completed in 516. The people find hope but are still under the threats of enemies and marauders. They rebuild their homes inside the walls, but the walls are still just a bit too much for them to be able to tackle. Nehemiah has been serving years under a king named Artaxerxes I as his cupbearer. One of his brothers who had been to and is coming from Jerusalem tells Nehemiah about the remnant that has survived the exile and how they are now in great trouble and disgrace, and how the walls of Jerusalem are broken down and the gates have been burnt to the ground by fire. And the scriptures say Nehemiah sat down and he wept. For days he mourned and he fasted and he prayed. And friends, this is what he prayed. Let me share it with you straight from Nehemiah 1, 5 through 11. Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to the prayer your servant is praying before you today. Praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you amongst the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, O God, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was a cupbearer to the king. So after Nehemiah has prayed, he goes before this man, the king, and he requests favor in going to Jerusalem to rebuild its walls. They set a time for this work. Nehemiah requests letters to the surrounding governors to provide him safety, and then he sets out to rebuild the walls. Once he arrives, immediately those in the region of Jerusalem were disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. One of the key insights about Nehemiah is his leadership style, and it's one of the reasons I really like this story. Watch as the story unfolds. Let's compare for a moment his style to Moses, where the people who have been slaves and in bondage in Egypt really have no identity that they've created for themselves yet. And they are only used to this hierarchical system. So they say to Moses, Moses, you lead us. You tell us what to do, and we'll do it. Compare that to the Jerusalem Council in Acts, where the disciples represent the people as they make decisions on who could be included in this Jesus way and what the guidelines should be. And then those are passed down. What is unique in Nehemiah is that he is a visionary leader. In his prayer, we realize he prays for success. He prays for favor, but it's not for his personal advantage or his personal acclaim. It's for his people. He actually has no authority at all other than the king's letters. No one in Jerusalem really knows him, but they do recognize when he comes, he's speaking on behalf of their souls and what they have all been longing for and hoping for. He relates and he connects his vision with their hopes and with their dreams. Notice, he goes out at night, not wanting to call attention to the work God has put in his heart to do. He spends several days assessing the damage of the walls and the gates, and after several days of thoughtful consideration, he presents a plan. He then calls the leaders together and presents this plan to rebuild the walls so that the people would no longer be in disgrace and fear. And then he shares how God has led him to this place, how God has led him down this path, and how the king has been gracious to him to let him come back to Jerusalem. The leaders discern this plan is from God. It doesn't even say they voted on it. It does say they said, let us start building. And they began what the scripture calls this good work. Now, the chapters that follow lay out in some details those who participated in rebuilding the walls and who rebuilt what gates. It was a huge process, and it wasn't without opposition. The words of one leader in the region who felt threatened and opposed the rebuilding came from Sanballat in chapter 4. Being angry and greatly incensed, he ridicules the Jews in the presence of his associates and those who might be listening around the wall where he's at. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore the wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish this wall in a day? Can they bring stones back to life? And a colleague that's close by in jest says, what they are building, if even a fox climbed up on it, it would break down their wall of stones. And you can almost hear the laughter filter through the army. Ha ha ha, as the insults continued. Have you ever had a vision or a dream or a hope or longing, and it either got shot down or maybe ridiculed as you began and you found it hard to continue? It's so easy to tear something or someone else down. It's easy to be a taillight instead of a headlight. It takes much more to build up than it does to tear down. What kept Nehemiah and the people moving forward to rebuild the wall? Well, Nehemiah was a great leader, but he also had the support and the investment and the energy of all the people. They were able to rebuild because, as the scripture says in chapter 4, verse 6, the people worked at it with all their heart. One key way each one was invested is that Nehemiah had each family work on the section of the wall that was just outside their home. They stationed guards. They came up with plans like blowing horns to alert each other to danger. They were in it together, and over the people were reminded, our God will fight for us. They looked out for each other, which meant each one could put forth their best effort. They stayed connected. As our leadership team met on Tuesday evening, we discussed what were the most important things we needed to be paying attention to in the life of the church through this pandemic with so much social isolation. We heard words like support, acceptance, and communication. And if you read the story of Nehemiah, you'll notice all these elements were part of the Israelites' ability to rebuild the walls. Over and over again, we also heard how important, and maybe most importantly, connection is right now. We have had to rethink church life since we've been in this pandemic, fighting an unseen enemy that keeps raising its head in jest. And yet, as God's people, we're seeking ways to stay connected and how we might keep growing in faith. And it means we have to pay attention to what's happening around us and what's going on inside of us. And when opportunity presents itself, like prayer Zooms and book studies and small groups and divorce care and drive-in worship services, that we sign up and we get connected. In many ways, our country is in a rebuilding stage where people at odds need to find ways to come together for the greater good, to invest together to bring some healing and unity amongst those who don't always agree but don't need to be disagreeable either. Nehemiah was able to unite the people because they all saw the benefit and how looking out for each other benefited everyone. Jesus said it best: love God, love your neighbor, love and pray for your enemies. And how are we, or how are you, or how even am I doing with that? Amazingly, that's not all that happened under Nehemiah. For you see, even the Jewish leaders needed a change of heart because it was discovered that they were taking advantage of their own people, to which Nehemiah called them one, saying, what you are doing is not right. And those in leadership, when they heard that, understood and said, you're right. We will give back their fields. We will give back their vineyards and their olive groves. We will do as you say. Now, why would they do that? People in power. Because they knew. They knew Nehemiah was driven by godly motives, morals, character, and faith. And they chose to respond in fashion. Well, the wall is finally completed in around 445 BCE. No short process, mind you. Their enemies relented. They were afraid. And their enemies lost their self-confidence because they came to realize this work had been done with the help of God. The prophet Ezra has been present, now is part of helping the people to renew the covenant to be God's people in this place. He read from the Torah and explained it to the people. He gave it meaning. The people wept as they listened, For they realized they had lost their focus on God. And Nehemiah speaks again, saying, "People, do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." And once again, they found joy in forgiveness and hope in a new beginning. And they all agreed, we will not neglect the house of God. So when we think of our day, what is it you think needs to be rebuilt? It might be a broken down relationship or friendship. I'm sure in rebuilding the wall, a few things were tossed aside and new stones or wood was added. Even with a building like ours here at Aldersgate, we will return to this place one day as we move through this pandemic. Our trustees and leadership team are working hard on improving our lighting right here in the sanctuary, replacing shingles on some of the deteriorating sections of our roof, cleaning up our stucco that has a lot of stain on it. We do have God's house to take care of, and we need your help. As we too reconnect as God's people coming back together, how is it that we're going to work together, serve and worship together? In what ways will we renew our covenant to share the love of Christ with others, even if we do face some opposition along the way? We have to keep our eyes focused on the prize as we rebuild and build together. To keep our eyes on things like love and justice and kindness, even when challenged or attacked. There are no triumphs without troubles. Staying connected, we can build God's church and grow God's kingdom together. One day, yes, one day, we too will return from our homes and communities. We know that we'll continue to gather with folks virtually. We will be the church moving forward. And it may not all look like it did before. We will need to put our hearts into rebuilding our ministries and missions as we move towards a new day. We'll need a God-given plan to do so. And know that the world is watching outside our walls. And then the real challenges become, how do we let our proverbial walls that divide us come down and learn to embrace a hurting world so that the church once again becomes influential in our day and in the lives of those we give witness to all around us. Just like rebuilding those walls in Nehemiah's day, friends, it's not going to be easy. But God will be with us as we discern our way forward and rebuild together with hope. And you know what I know? Our hearts will all be together in it.